Welcome to this video. This video is going to be called What Should Instruments Actually Sound Like? This is something that has been affected deeply by the history of recording, and even more so by more recent digital advancements. And so the nature of performed instruments and what they are and what you're listening to is now very vague, and it's something that doesn't get discussed a lot. Okay? So I had a friend ring me up last night, and they're an engineer and producer, and they were telling me a story that they've been recording a band, and I know the guys in the band. They've recorded the drums and then given them the drum stems to them to take away to mix. So they're just doing a thing of tracking, right? The drums have been recorded in the standard way, you know, mics on that, blah, 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 and all that type of thing. 4 songs were recorded, that was taken away. Then they've come back to do the next 4 songs, and those have been recorded. But when they took those back, they felt that the drum sound was not the same. And they felt that this could be the fault of the engineer in the fact that the miking wasn't the same. And they rang me up to have a chat about this. And for me, that didn't seem quite right. And I want to explore it and use this example to explore it for non-musicians to understand how the industry works, and then extrapolate it on so you start to get an idea of how we perceive as professional musicians and producers real instruments. Because when we're saying real instruments, it doesn't mean those instruments are real, right? And I don't mean program instruments pretending to be real. I'm saying that what you are listening to might be somebody really playing, but you're not actually hearing the sound of them. It's very interesting, this is. So when they rang up and said, you know what, they've said they can't get the same mix. Now, the thing is, with drums, the way you record drums is you use lots of different microphones. You put a microphone, usually 2 microphones above it, and they give you a stereo image of the drum kit from above. You might put a room right at the other end, and that's a room mic, and that will give you that big Bonhamy sound. And often those are compressed quite hard, and it gives you this great big rocky sound, you know, because that mic is picking up just the echo and all the reverb. And that's always a very interesting thing to do. Then you put mics on every single drum. You put a mic on every single tom-tom. Often you'll put 2 snare mics on the snare drum, sometimes 3 mics on the snare drum. Sometimes you'll put 1 mic inside the bass drum, but often you'll have 2 or even 3. Even here in my lowly studio here, I use 2 mics to record the bass drum, and sometimes 3. So this is a lot of different mics. So then what you do is you take those away, and then you have to mix and blend every single track. So when you put them all together, right, like all the bits of a painting, they create a whole. And this is an art form, because your bass drum will be feeding into the sound of the overheads, and it's feeding into the sound on all the other microphones as well. And then on top of this, and this absolutely does your head in, is when you hit your snare drum, the mic that's right on top of the snare drum records the snare as it's being hit, but your overhead is actually it's a distance away, and it takes, you know, a microsecond to travel there, but it is a microsecond. So rather than the waves being like that, they're actually off, and this creates a thing called phasing. Now with 10 or 12 mics, you've got phasing all around the kit, so that has to be looked after. So it's a difficult thing. And so we have a ton of elements that are chaotic in terms of the sound. So an engineer who wanted to record a drum kit on that day and then record the same kit in the other day, and for the sounds to be identical, would have to think of a whole bunch of parameters. Obviously, the mics would have to be the same because the mics have a certain sound. The mics would have to be in a certain position on the drum. If they were in a slightly different position, it would be a slightly different sound. You would have to make sure you've got your overheads and that room sound. Now, one of the things that happened with this is on the second session, it was decided not to put a room mic up, but when they got home, they realized they hadn't got a room mic, and this was sort of used as evidence of why the second session has gone wrong. Now, this is not an issue. I've had this so many times where you miss a mic, And actually, all you have to do is go back into the studio, get the sort of dry sound of the drums, do a sort of a room, just natural mix of the drums, play it through a PA, stick your mic at the end of the room, and it will replicate the echo. You'll be able to record that sound. Often that method is even better than actually having a room mic on the drums themselves, because you can now colour the drums that are coming through the PA and you can control it, bring it down the volume, get more of the echo, all sorts of that things you could do. There's no issue that it would be very easy to replicate that room mic if you wanted. But the thing is, it reminds me of a story that my drum tech told me, is that they were in a studio making an album for a certain band, a rock album. All the drums are set up. And halfway through, they've broken a drum head and they need to change the heads. And so this guy had to spend the whole night sat in that studio matching the sound of the drum kit to what was originally there. Because what determines your drum sound in a studio, far more than the mics and the mic position, is the sound of the drum kit. That might sound really basic to non-musicians. I go, well, yeah, of course it is. You know, the mics are recording the drums. It's what the drums sound like, surely. Yeah, that is the case. But the thing is, so much is done in the studio that musicians start to think it's about the miking and the production and all the gates and compressors that are being used. And often people will pick up one session and drop it into an old session when they've got all the settings there. And when it doesn't sound the same, they think, well, what's going on? The reason is because the anomalies that stack up. And the biggest anomaly is the sound of the drums. Right, so even if I had the same tom-tom, and even if it had the same drum head on it, if you've been playing that tom-tom over time, the sound of that drum head has changed because you've been hitting it. It will be duller and it will maybe lower, and you might have actually taken the middle out of it, so the sound will be kaput anyway. So if you put a different head on, that different head is going to sound different. If you get two heads that are the same make, two drum heads the same make, they still sound different. All right, it's incredible. So even if you've left that drum as it is, it will sound different, but you won't have, because everybody, when they get to a gig, if they're using that kit or they're playing on it, because of temperature and heat, the drums go up and down. If you just left them in and put them in a box and then got them out, they would still sound different. If you want an analogy of that, think about a guitar. You know, think you've got a guitar and it's all tuned up, and you stick it in the case, and you stick it, you know, on the side for say a month or so and pull it out. If it's a good guitar, it might still be in tune, but it's highly likely that it's no longer in tune and no one's touched it. It's just the atmospherics, its temperatures, all sorts of things. And so I literally, when I'm playing my drums and practicing, I am tuning all the time. I'm tuning. I'm working towards things. The drums are slipping, they're changing, and you know, if I play them really hard, they will all drop down. So I'm tuning all the time. And basically, if you've got a tom, or even more so a snare drum, right, that snare drum, it's very easy for it to be a semitone higher or lower than it was before. It only takes one crank of a peg. So that's the tuning, and to match a drum kit requires a drum tech in the room who knows what they're doing to tune the drums so they sound a certain way. Now, what I found interesting about this story is that the band weren't aware of that, and how much they were focused on the fact that it's the production that makes the drums sound and not the drums. Now, if this were to happen, you shouldn't complain about it, because there's ways of fixing it. The obvious thing to do would be to take the drum sounds and tune them in the mix. You can actually bring things up in pitch and match the pitch and the sound. If something's, you know, that you should be able to the mix to go some way to matching those sounds. But if you can't, then another thing you could do is re-trigger. So what you could do is use both drums from separate sessions to trigger some established sounds. Now, most drum kits you hear on a record now are triggered. I hate this. Most albums you listen to now that have real drums on, it might be somebody really playing them, but you're not hearing the sound of their drums. Their drum is just being used to trigger another sound. Okay? And so you are listening to the sounds that are in the computer. There is no air moving. There is no mic actually recording anything that you're hearing. You're not listening to the drum kit. You are listening to, in effect, electric drum kit sounds, right? This shocks people, but it is the case. And it's such the case that when you start to use these sounds, it's so expensive to, in the studio, get close to those sounds. Now, I'll explain that. Say you're a company, you want to create some drum sounds for your new triggering system, whether it be BFD or maybe it's Superior Drummer. So you'll go to a drummer, maybe you go to Simon Phillips, who's got the best drum sound in the world. He's got a £100,000 kit. He knows exactly how to tune it and he knows exactly how to mic it. You take it to a studio that's far more expensive than you could ever afford and put it in a room that sounds far more better than the studio you're in. And then you get Simon Phillips, who's a virtuoso, to hit that drum, right? And he hits it over and over again at all different dynamics and you get the sound of that. You cannot replicate that. So when you're trying to make your band and you've got the choice between Simon Phillips' snare drum sound or yours, you'll go for Simon Phillips's and it will sound better. And because everybody does that, every drum sound sounds the same, right? Except for Simon Phillips, because Simon Phillips doesn't do that. If you listen to a Simon Phillips album, they are real drums, and he has tuned them to the room, and he's tuned them to what he's playing, and he's altered his tuning. And I'm sure if he's watching this, he'll agree. That's the beauty of the drums, is that they can be, if you know what you're doing in the studio, you know, they can be sculpted and created to fit the sound. It's wonderful. You know, move the mics away, move them closer, put the overheads up in more, make it more drier. You know, put a bit more compression on it or make it more natural. You can do all these things. You can't when that sound is fixed, right? Because that sound that you hear in these drum packages that trigger drums aren't just the sound of the drum. Often there's EQ there, there's gating, there's all sorts of things. That has also been sculpted. We haven't got a clue what we listen to. The idea of arguing about this is ridiculous, right? Now, if you wanted the second drum part to sound like the first drum part, what you could do is sample yourself the first kit and trigger it off the second kit. All right? Now, all of this is an easy fix. But the idea that what we've got here is people complaining about this, I think is not right. I haven't named any names. People who watch this will know who they are. But my opinion is that it would have been much better just to go back to the engineer and say, look, we can't match them and have some advice. The idea that recording's a straight line, the idea when you go into a studio, you can pay for something and get it, it's never been like that. Every time you start the studio, it's trial and error. All right, this is why people have deals, and this is why sometimes in the old days they stay in the studio for months on end, because it's trial and error. The idea that you could go into a studio on a second session and have the drums match the first is almost impossible, I would say, without a whole ton of preparation. You have to approach that like a military operation. But here, I come to the fundamental aspect of why I've done this video is not to explain that, right? Why do they have to sound the same? That's the bit I don't understand. Why do they need to sound the same? Where's that aesthetic coming from? Right? I don't have that. I might record the first verse and chorus with one drum sound, and then I'll record the second, even in the same song, I will change drum sounds. And rather than trying to get the production to do what I want it to do, I relax and see what the production tells me to do. It's a different approach to production, because I do this because I believe it creates better recordings and creates better music. I think that if you had an album where every single drum part was exactly the same, so you're trying to replicate the idea that this band is live in the studio, that's a production approach you could do. But for me, the production approach to do that would be to get everyone to play in the room at the same time and record it all at the same time. Once you start overdubbing and cutting things together and editing and fixing and stuff like this, you're into a world of fakeness. And I believe rather than try and fake it and pretend that you're a band in the room, it's much better to accept that aesthetic. This is what the Beatles did, you know, as they moved from their first album, which was them recording all in the same room, to Revolver. By the time they got to Revolver, all the bets were off. They had Brian Wilson, you know, with Pet Sounds, and then more incredibly for me on Good Vibrations, and then Frank Zappa. This idea that the studio is a way of creating interesting things that are compelling. To do that, you have to accept the process. And I have a strong belief that when we make art, if we attempt to try and force our artistic vision onto the art, we diminish it, because most people's artistic vision is feeble. I don't think that's what art is. The painter that gets up and walks out in the morning and sees that incredible sunset, they react to the sunset. There is no art without the sunset. The author that hears some story that's been told down the pub, and it's an interesting story, it's compelling, they spot that story, it's not theirs. What they do is they put a frame around it. And one of the things I love about recording studios is when you walk in, anything could happen. And so for me, if you are honest to what's going on in this situation, there will be one drum sound on one set of tracks and another drum sound in on another set of tracks. And when you mix it, every drum sound should be mixed particular to that track. What you would create then is a drum sound that changes throughout the album. And for my take, that is one of the advantages of a studio album. When Led Zeppelin went into the studio, the reason why, or one of the reasons why they made such an impression, is that Jimmy Page, their guitar player, had also worked as a session musician in recording studios and had been studying recording and was actually a brilliant producer. Their bass player, John Paul Jones, had been working as an arranger, and putting production and arrangement together made Led Zeppelin sound different to Cream or the other groups that had gone before. Although Jimi Hendrix also pioneered a lot of this stuff. So when you put a Led Zeppelin album on, the guitar parts are continually different, and they're different within bars. A brilliant example of this would be Jimi Hendrix's guitar solo, which is one of the greatest guitar solos ever made, on All Along the Watchtower, which every 2 bars or something completely changes its sound. Led Zeppelin, if you put on Led Zeppelin 4 and you listen to the drum sounds and you listen to 4 Sticks, and then you compare that sound to, say, When the Levee Breaks, those are different drum sounds. We should be able to accommodate this. So why is this young band not able to accommodate it? And the reason is because they are making a heavy metal record. And a heavy metal record has become too delineated stylistically. The genre is so strong now, and it's so divided up into subgenres, that anything that a band does now, a young band in the world of heavy metal, will be seen as being heretical in terms of the style. Right? So what I mean by this is that most bands, when they start, cannot adhere to the aesthetic requirements production-wise, which are needed to be able to get that on rock radio and for the audience to accept it's a heavy metal record. The guitars have to be a certain way, the bass has to be a certain way, and the drums have to be a certain way. And they all have to sound a certain way. And because of that, people have learned how to do it. So when you put a modern metal record on, that guitar is not a recording of the guitar. That is a recording of the guitar's clean sound that has been fed into the computer. And then the computer is emulating a great big amp on stage, all distorted and heavy. Exactly the same with the bass. And when those guitars have been recorded in, every single bar has been chopped to make it sound absolutely consistent. And any dynamic variation has been taken away. So it's either full volume or not. Right? When it comes to the drums, this starts to become more and more important. And with the modern metal album, the bass drums are the most important sound. And so these are often triggered. A lot of modern metal drummers have fake bass drums because they're actually playing electronic triggers. And those triggers are not set up like you would have on a normal electronic kit. Their dynamics are very flat. So you only have to touch it or hit it hard, you will still get that big clicky thump. And the clicky thump is basically this. I'm sat on a leather chair. All right. I could record that there with one mic and get a bass drum sound that would be more satisfactory to the modern metal audience than an actual bass drum that just doesn't sound like that. The drums are being put to make sound like that. Once those bass drums are there, right, when you mix a metal album, right, the way to mix the metal album, if you want to know, if you want to conform to the cliche, is I put the bass drums up first and I put them up at 0 dB. They're at front. Then I bring the guitars in so the guitars are matched. Electric guitars and bass drums, they're up front. And then everything is brought in underneath at a lower level, including the snare drum, including the overheads, including the toms, including the bass. Even the vocal is all brought under that. You make sure that the bass drums and the guitars are up front. And once you've got the whole mix, then you limit and compress the whole mix, which sucks up the sound in between, makes that sound at the right volume. But always you are getting that, you know, thud that I just demonstrated so well on my leather chair or faux leather chair, right? And in the same way, this is not a real chair. Those bass drums are not real bass drums. They're faux bass drums, right? Now, I have said to my students who are into metal, you know, you have to conform to that. You won't get your stuff on the radio. You won't get interest. You won't get books gigged unless you get in there, fake your playing, program it in the computer. So the easiest way of doing this is not to go to a studio, but is to program your drums. That is the best thing to do. And so when I hear this argument, oh, we want real drums on it, blah, 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 well, there will be limitations unless you've got unlimited budgets, because what you're asking is not possible. And these are the production issues that we have in the industry at the moment. It's particularly common around heavy metal. And so when I was working with young bands, I hooked up with a number of producers. My old mate John Mitchell from Frost was also known as a metal and rock producer, and he was able to create the sound that would then be able to be put on rock radio. Just up the road from here in a village called Rock, which I think is always very funny, is an old student of mine that's turned out to be a brilliant rock producer, a guy called Jay Shredder, and I'm mentioning him so I can send him a message. I mentioned you here. And he's able to deliver this, right? My friend who's engineering this, he's also able to deliver this, but matching drum sounds in the way I've said, that's a difficult thing to do. And I wonder the utility of it. And what I see over and over again is that musicians who are trying to break into the industry often come unstuck, because when it gets to the production and the sound, this actually creates bad feeling. And people believe so wholesale because they're often spending money to get to that sound. They've invested in it. And so they feel that they've been undone by the production, and they are willing to sacrifice friendships and all sorts of things. I have fallen out with a number of bands over drum sounds, and it's basically been me sat there thinking, my God, my drums don't exist anymore.
Sorry to interrupt this show in this rude and annoying way, but I just wanted to tell you about a few ways that you can support me here on YouTube and get access to even more weirder and wackier content. First of all, you could become a patron. You could become a free member or a paid up member. I have over 300 extra videos on there, and if you don't even want to become a member, please pop over, because you can access my collections where you can purchase even more weirder and wackier video content. If you want to support me financially with a little tip, buy me some biscuits or maybe some crisps, you could pop over to my PayPal tip jar. I also have a Substack where I have lots of clever, academic and thought out articles where I explain my ideas on art, culture and creativity in a more intelligent way than I do here, plus a whole ton of podcasts. If you want to know what my music sounds like, you can pop over to my Bandcamp. Over there, you'll be able to listen to over 50 albums, and if you want to access them all, you could become a subscriber. And last but not least, if you want to support the wonderful studio where I film these lovely videos, which is actually a charity trying to help people out in the community become more creative. Here is the website where you could drop a few pounds or dollars or whatever the currency is in your country in there. Thanks for listening, and back to the show.